program of 2014 as we read together Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Today's talk will focus on the significance of the actions of Victor Frankenstein and the monster in a psychological sense, what compelled them or impelled them to act the way they did, and also the study of why Frankenstein has become a cultural icon. One of our panelists, Kamala Richardson, cannot be with us today due to a family emergency, but we will be educated and entertained by our two remaining panelists. Alice Kociemba, a Falmouth psychotherapist and counselor, is also an accomplished poet who nurtures local poets with poetry open readings at the West Falmouth Library, and who has been leading a monthly poetry book discussion group here at the Falmouth Library for several years, and I've lost count of the number of years. Ongoing successful program. Our second panelist is Falmouth native David Kociemba. No relation. Who graduated from Falmouth High School in 1992, so he's a real townie, and he is now a professor of literature at Emerson College. And he will speak about Frankenstein's monster as a cultural icon. And David, will you open our program?
Sure. Okay, is the microphone picking me up? Can you all hear me okay? Hi. Okay, I've presented a PowerPoint slide here. I've put this together. And the beginning is just sort of a quick survey to sort of establish just how omnipresent, how present Frankenstein's monster is in our culture. It's sort of fascinating to sort of see the dispersion of this first-time novelist's creation, very much an insider and an outsider to the English sort of literary scene, sort of from a sort of an infamous sort of progressive literary family, but also an 18-year-old girl, sort of in a scandalous relationship with a very, very well-known and infamous poet as well. So I'm going to sort of show you how Frankenstein's monster is alive, and then talk about how that sort of open image of the nameless creature monster of this book has sort of found its way into our culture, and how we've sort of provide a survey of how we've read this book and how we've read into it as well. So we'll take a look through this, and we'll hit to the text-heavy slides towards the end. So one of his roots is from the sort of very ancient story of the Golem, defender of the Jews, sort of an automaton like Frankenstein and all of the creatures that would follow Frankenstein, but a defender, and overtly sort of a follower rather than sort of a rebellious slave, as we will sort of take a look at Frankenstein's monster in that way. Obviously, this is one of the places where we best as Americans know this figure is through the Universal films of the first monster movie craze, which would lead us to such greats as Dracula by Todd Browning, and Freaks, actually, as well, by Todd Browning, as Freaks was a film almost immediately banned for being too horrifying. And the fact that it was a part of the sort of the monster movie craze, along with the Wolfman and Dracula and Frankenstein, tells us something about the figure of Frankenstein as a freak. As a sideshow in our sort of literary history. Obviously, there would be sequels, many, many sequels. So today's sort of summer movies franchises, as we have Die Hard 5 and all of that, goes back to the origins of sound cinema in Hollywood. And we have this with The Bride of Frankenstein. And this is not an actual movie. But it is a happenstance occurrence in the studio, and someone lovingly took the photograph of this little moment. And of course, we have, anytime a figure becomes a cultural icon, we have sort of satire follows in its wake. And it's telling that there have been several waves of satire and comedy around this book. It says how central this figure has become to various generations. So here we have Abbott and Costello facing seemingly the entire Universal film studio lot. And then, of course, we have the second satire, Young Frankenstein, or as the creator in this film would say, Frankenstein. And this is what would lead to the monster's sort of rebellion, is a song and dance routine. We also, of course, for those of you who remember the television of your youth, is the Munsters. Here, I believe, giving a radio interview, so updated for new media. And we've had yet another family, this coming out very recently, with Fran Drescher as Frankenstein's wife, and a little son. And there was, of course, a Son of Frankenstein movie as well. And for those of you who are fans of primetime television that deals intricately with our fairy tales, folklore, and icons, we have Once Upon a Time, where he shows up as the first non-fairy tale figure, Dr. Frankenstein, and his brother, as we have him this sort of the family dimension of this novel sort of stitched together, as you will, more tightly. And as in the book, it doesn't work out so well for this little family melodrama, as my mother will talk about how these often don't. So it ends in sort of strangulation, attempted suicide, beatings, in the land without colors, where this occurs. We also have the Sci-Fi Channel and sci-fi movies of Rebellious Slaves. The bottom image is from Battlestar Galactica, the reboot. So those of you who remember the post-Star Wars version, there was a reboot of this. And it was indeed one of the most popular shows in the history of the Sci-Fi Channel, was essentially taking the concept of the rebellious slave of Frankenstein as this, believe it or not, this young woman is a robot, an android. And of course, we have Isaac Asimov's, so this filmic adaptation of Isaac Asimov's famous sort of representation of what would happen with sentient robots, the iRobot series. He's also, of course, been in comic books. Any icon ends up in comic books, it seems, nowadays. In the image to your right is when he goes back in time and deals with natives. We also have Frankenstein as a modern sort of superhero action figure, brought in when you're not dealing with supervillains, but rather with monsters from beyond our ken, dealing with sort of the monstrous supernatural. And he's basically this brooding anti-hero, but again, these images are sort of leading us to sort of think about when things get dispersed so broadly, what remains from the original source text is that which is essential to our culture. So as we get further and further away from the book, the things that remain are the ones that are foundational. And as we can see, the concept of slavery, of judgment, of sort of the question of whether it is indeed the meek that inherit the earth becomes central as well. We have family in Japan, as this has not only crossed the Atlantic but crossed the Pacific as well, with a family of sisters. The one in the middle, with the black hat who looks sort of like a Puritan, has sort of Frankenstein by way of Edward Scissorhands, as she has scythes for hands and buckets of blood occur. And we have, it wouldn't be a sort of a quirky myth without Tim Burton. So we have a boy scientist and his Frankenweenie as his dog, who forgets the death of their first pet. And we of course have Poodle of Frankenweenie with the poodle next door. And lastly, we have a popular girl, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, sort of in Monster High here, as sort of stitched together with style. And so the question that we're going to lead into here is why? Why did the monster become so culturally prominent? Why do we dress up babies like Frankenstein? Why do we vote the Monster Party in our elections? And the reason is, I think, to start, is it's such an open text that there's a lot of room for you as readers to sort of read this from your particular position as readers, for what concerns you, what issues speak to your heart. Stories become more powerful the more we share them, but also that the more particularized they are. And this is what cultural objects like this do very well. And so what we have here is the monster that never dies, but rather floats off the page and shambles into our culture as an open symbol to be filled by readers, in particular, particular time periods. So there's a set of quick takes that I'm going to reference for you to sort of keep an eye out as you do your reading, as was mentioned. But also sort of we'll go in depth into several other sort of approaches to understanding why Frankenstein's monster has so gripped our imaginations and indeed as our empathy. So first of all, is of course we have it as an existential fable. The monster famously teaches himself language, English sort of history and philosophy, and he's a self-made man, sort of the nightmare scenario of Robinson Crusoe, the first self-made man in English literature. And indeed, Robinson Crusoe was the first blockbuster English novel, which this would eventually sort of become as well. There's also the commentary on the split between reason and feeling, which I think I'm going to sort of defer to my mother on this one. But I'll simply note that Frankenstein, as a doctor in the experiments, cannot do science and think lovingly of his family at the same time. He overtly sort of puts them from his mind. So we have the separation of the masculine and the feminine, the animus and the anima. We have the excesses of idealism and genius countered by the gross physicality of grave robbing and corpse pieces and all of this, all the grotesquerie that one sort of you'll come to read. I'll talk later on at greater depth about the doublings of various characters, how in some ways this is a single consciousness refracted into many characters, where each character in some ways is an aspect of Victor Frankenstein, and we'll sort of go into that as well. We also have the attack of nature and its revenge, as a man giving birth to his monster in a laboratory rather than naturally leads to all sorts of fevers and nervous anxieties and spells that my mother will diagnose. And rain, thunder, lightning, high seas. It is as if Mother Nature cries out in revenge at what Dr. Frankenstein has done. The Dr. Victor grows emaciated and pale in his unnatural pregnancy in the laboratory. So we have this sort of ambivalence towards ambition. Paradise Lost was a signature text in the education of Shelley, of Mary Shelley. Faust is obviously as well, as overweening ambition is, Satan and Faust are our go-to icons when it comes to that, but also Prometheus, as the subtitle of the book also indicates. I would also suggest that as an artwork gone awry, rejected by its creator, that this is a story of Pygmalion, where a novel sort of takes on a life of its own beyond the wildest imaginings of its author. So too with Victor Frankenstein and his living sculpture, his creature, his monster. And so we have, sometimes we talk about this concept of following where the work goes when we talk about the muse. This is sort of the icon we use to discuss this, but Frankenstein works there as well. Lastly, we have the figure of the robot, and this connects in two ways. One is this is a work during the height of British, or rather English colonialism. And one can certainly sort of look at this from a colonialist perspective of the monster being at its core initially a creature. Good in its soul, but his rejection by his master, who he calls a master, he is called a slave, and he is as he is treated. He may be sort of grotesque on the outside, foreign and strange to the Englishman reading this and to the Englishman in the text, but ultimately he rises to his one-man guerrilla war due to his oppression and strives to overcome it. So this is one way to sort of look at this. We've also analogized this with robots and master-slave architecture and the like. The appeal of the monster is another sort of thing that we should sort of talk about. This is out of order. And I've put up on the screen here quite a few common sort of understandings of the appeal of the monster over time. The horror genre, and this is only partially in the horror genre as a book, features the depiction of the grotesque, which this book has in spades with its sort of stitching together of corpses. It has as well audience anxiety on behalf of young brothers and fiancés on their wedding night, and scientists who've done things that man was not meant to know. But also we have empathy for the awful other. We see ourselves over and over again in these monsters. But we cannot face what we see there, and so that monster, which has been repressed, must be repressed again once we sort of subconsciously or even consciously face this creature. It must be demonized and expelled to protect our self-concept. And so we have this sort of implicated and distance view, sort of position at the same time. We're in the text and also sort of protectively away from the text at the same time. And I encourage you as you read the book to think about the modern slasher movie with the displacement of sex into violence as that becomes a major feature in this very, very early book of the Gothic. And so the appeals of this sort of vary over time, whether with Lovecraft talking about sort of the aesthetic appeal of a miasmic tone of dread and anticipation, or whether it be sort of examining the consequences socially and morally and metaphysically of deviance from the norm, of being different, or simply repulsion and curiosity of what happens to the body after death. This book hits a lot of what would become a sort of major features of the horror genre, and that reflects its origins as beginning in some ways at a dare to tell a ghost story. And so it sort of finds its tropes reflected there. That's going to come back. All right. Lastly, there's David Cronenberg is sort of a very sort of a cult Canadian horror film director, quite smart despite the fact that his works are really grotesque and gross, physically, palpably gross. And I'm not going to have you read all of this. I wanted just sort of that to be up there so you'd have something nice to look at while I nattered on. But the idea of horror and of Frankenstein, especially to original audiences who repeatedly asked Mary Shelley, how did you think of such a thing? How did you spend so many years developing such an awful story? And Cronenberg has sort of said that audiences want to be overwhelmed. They want to be overwhelmed by the sensations of terror, of horror, of revulsion, of the unease, and they don't appreciate it if you can't, if you don't. That's why you pick up a book like Frankenstein, is to put yourself in the author's hands and to have yourself be taken overwhelmed by the experience of the text. And the other part of it he talks about is we just can't get a handle on death. The old Cartesian mind-body distinction, that this is the basis of horror, which is why should a healthy mind die when just because the body is not healthy? And my mother will talk about the timing of this particular revelation for Victor in the book is notably significant. Yes, the death of the mother. So in addition to sort of this figure of the strivers of the middle classes, this rebellious slave, this feeling of being overwhelmed by our confrontation with the awful other through the medium of text, by the author sort of being dominated, if you will, by this experience, we also have a less dark understanding of why this has been such an appeal. And I teach disability studies as well at Emerson College, and so I teach a course called Images of the Disabled, and this is drawn from that. You might think of Frankenstein's monster or creature as a figure of a disabled person, a disabled person whose disability is quite visible. It is he has black lips, he's 8 feet tall, he's got watery eyes, this weird complexion that he's been granted, and he's literally stitched together. And so we literarily stare at him, but eventually I'm arguing one of the appeals of Frankenstein's monster is that we learn to behold him. We learn to look at him with new eyes through the prism of art. And I want to briefly present this theory from a very foundational theory from disability studies. And I recognize that I have enough time to do this, so I think I'm going to do it. Susan Sontag wrote on a book called On the Pain of Others. And it was a book of photography that sort of looked at war photography, surgery photography, things like that, and was sort of looking at why do we engage in this? Why do we engage in this? And she was worried that it was all Schadenfreude, which is, of course, German. And Schadenfreude means taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. If you watch The Simpsons, there's a small boy who points and laughs at people who experience misfortune publicly. That's sort of Schadenfreude. But this bad staring is a failure of empathy. All I and no thou. This cannot be me. Where she regards good staring as one that sort of creates a sort of a kind of empathy. And Rosemary Garland Thompson sort of regards this as important because the general sort of thing that we teach our children is not to stare. Don't stare at that person. But staring is in fact inevitable. We all stare, she writes. She's a disabled author, and she says, sights that stimulate our eyes can lead to many different sort of reactions: wonder, horror, or just thrills. And I'd say the same thing happens in reading this book. So we are all potential starers, and we are all potential starees, people who are stared at some points in our lives. And a stare is simply a response to someone's distinctiveness. And if mutual, if if we go back and forth between starer and staree, it can be a productive, if volatile, social relationship that produces recognition, mutuality. And so the question isn't whether we should stare, but rather how we should stare. And this book, I would argue, models how to sort of re-see the monster, starting with our sort of reaction from Victor, but we are taught by the monster how to regard him in two crucial sections of the book. Elaine Scarry talks as well. I mean, the Victor rejects his creation largely because it's ugly and he's embarrassed, and his father plays into this as well, and I'm going to just pass that on to you. The idea is that beauty catches our interest. It creates knowledge, encourages scrutiny, and it creates a sense of the newness of the entire world. Beauty is novelty at work. And so it is not. It is that things that we stare at are beautiful, not things that are beautiful we stare at. Staring at beauty is a reaching out in some way. It's appreciation rather than rejection. And so ultimately, this is what we hope to do as we see, and this is where our sense of perhaps disappointment at the monster's fall is as well. And so Garland Thompson argues that if we can go from staring to a mutual stare, we bear witness to these people, and we see we gain the skill to see and recognize and appreciate livable lives, like the monsters could have been. And so what we usually see is unbearable pain or adversity or diminishment or a desire to be cured, but rather instead we can sort of see a livable life, a life with its virtues and its demerits like any other life. And so it becomes from simple staring, we have the potential to enact, in D.W. Winnicott's words, as my mother will talk about more, the holding function, which is where it's necessary to be held in visual regard by another. It enables human beings to flourish. The most subtly disastrous thing to do is for everyone to ignore you. This is so the denial of any recognition of your existence can be devastating, and that is central to this novel as well. That kind of visual exile of everyone looking away from you or hiding in primitive little huts, as will happen as well. So instead of this book helps us fight the social pressure towards visual conformity and appreciation of difference. And so this becomes sort of an essential thing that we learn from this novel, is to sort of see this other and to see aspects of ourselves and our experience of. We all experience some form of otherness in our lives. We all experience some form of privilege. We all experience some form of bias and otherness. And so we sort of learn to see ourselves and see others through the prism of art. And in addition, this work, which was regarded, believe it or not, as a work of realism, or at least engaging in sort of the traditions of realism, is bound up with another sort of major concept of this time period of the early 1800s, which is the term norm, normal, normalcy, did not enter the English language until, as you can see, just about 160 years ago. This is a relatively new concept in sort of history, which seems odd given how we're measured in everything we do, in our wealth, in our taste, in how much hair we have, in our SAT scores, in our GPA rank. You name it, we measure it. even when we go to the doctor, it's an orgy of measurement. The normal only comes about as a concept that becomes central with the Industrial Revolution and nationalism. And so this book is dealing with a relatively new idea that's burbling up into English consciousness, which was the epicenter of the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. It starts in England, and it sort of metastasizes outwards from there. And the reason for this happening is there was no real need for standardization of labor or standard products when your market is a village. It's actually artisans and craftsmen. It's like why you go shopping not at the mall but at downtown Falmouth is you want to support local artists, and what you're looking for there is not something standardized but unique and personal of the individual artist's sort of creation. And similarly, I mean, until you have factory lines, this is what happened. And so there was sort of no need for an average man without a factory, and in a factory you need an average man, and thus if you have an average man, you have an average man hour, and you have an average productivity, and from there you have sort of the attempt to sort of standardize the human. So what you have is from this is they sort of enter the English language, and the question I'm sure sort of that comes to my students when I talk about this in my classes is, if not the norm, what did we do? The ideal is actually the central term that predates this. We are all, prior to the idea of the norm, we are all in some ways grotesque before the divine ideal. We are united in sort of a spectrum of grotesquerie, but this is not the ideal bodies of Aphrodite are not like our photoshopped beauties of today, where we're supposed to try and emulate them, where we're supposed to have the muscles of Arnold Schwarzenegger or the photoshopped beauty of models in Vogue. Instead, we are not meant to sort of emulate Hercules or anything like that. They are sort of extraordinary and of a different kind, a different ken. These are the stories of kings, not of everymen. So that is sort of how this worked. Was we were the grotesque was a signifier of the people, of common life. And so some people have read Frankenstein's monster as the underclass, as the gross, disgusting poor people who must be sort of kept away from respectable scientists like Victor Frankenstein. And nationalism also plays a part in this. This is during the period where the statistical revolution starts with astronomy, with business statistics, as you have burgeoning international markets with the East India Tea Company. So you have the rise of the statistical analysis, and the nation-state uses this to norm the body politic. As a sort of a national security interest. The more healthy the body politic, the more strong and straight and not 8 feet tall and grotesque that the people are, the better your soldiers are, the better your businesses are, the better your mothers and your children are. And so you have fingerprinting, phrenology, physiognomy, Darwin's notion of evolutionary advantage. This was an attempt to sort of standardize the Frenchman, the German, the Englishman. And so you have a perfectible body for factory and for state, which Frankenstein is a complete rebellion against, a complete and utter rebellion against. And so one of this is to sort of encourage good births, but the other part of this was eugenics, which was to discourage bad births. It's notable that Dr. Frankenstein, when he starts making the monster, wants a race of people that will admire him like no son admired a father. It's a paraphrase from the text, which is, again, pretty resonant, Oedipus and all of that. But also, he refuses to make a bride, ultimately, for his creature after agreeing to do so, because he feared two things. Two things amongst many. One was that they would breed and create a race of monsters that would create a genetic apocalypse that would sort of take out all of humanity. And the other fear was miscegenation, that the bride of Frankenstein would reject Frankenstein's monster, but instead start to mate with ordinary, healthy Englishmen, and sort of dilute that gene pool as well. So fears around race and miscegenation were very much a part of this novel as well. And so it sort of deals with sort of very, very difficult pressure points around not only sort of men desiring women's amazing, wondrous ability to give birth, but also what happens when their fears take over that as well. And this leads us to the Gothic, because that's completely not rational. And that's where the Gothic makes its money, is the irrational, the emotional, the supernatural, the ghostly. And have no fear, I'm heading into the final spot, and I'll turn things over to my mother. So we have two last concepts, the Gothic and sort of the well-shaped text. The Gothic literature originates in Europe maybe 50 to 70 years before Mary Shelley. In fact, Gothic artists, some of the best-paid novelists at her time period were Gothic literary artists. Gothic artists were called terrorists in the 19th century. So this is, I mean, the stereotypical thing is like castles and monasteries, ghosts, forgotten spaces, mad women in the attic, mysterious aristocrats with strange predatory intentions, psychological torment rising to a fever pitch to madness, the mental illness and psychological disorder of the period preceding Freud. And Frankenstein is justifiably famous within this genre tradition. It was a popular genre. It was often associated with sentimentality, with excess, sometimes even with female audiences, as that would sort of evolve over time. But in particular, it was, like the monster, the Gothic was a rebellion against middle-class social mores. The rise of the middle classes during this period, this was the sort of the voice of concern and dissent, where you have sort of this mystery that must be understood, but it cannot be solved through logic, but rather through empathy and emotion and sentiment. All the things that Victor Frankenstein is just honestly quite terrible at. And we also have the American Gothic as well. The American Gothic sets it in wilderness rather than ancient structures like castles. And this is because, I mean, in the U.S., when it's transplanted to the U.S., it casts doubts on the popular myths of the United States as a land of innocence, a fresh start, of promise. The landscape is symbolic of the unpredictable realm of the imagination. The frontier. Before there was the Western, there was the American Gothic. And it's telling that this book will end in frontier territory. Not our frontier, but another one. And technology was also a signature concern in both Gothic types, as it causes a fundamental challenge to the physical world. Obviously, Frankenstein, galvanism, which he's using to sort of electrify a body and bring it to life. This technology, in the end, for American Gothic, will explain paranormal activity, to quote a famous movie title. And that's actually a good point. It's time for a drink. So what we're looking for here is the English Gothic had dealt with physical terror and social horror. The American Gothic would concentrate on mental terror and moral horror. And what's notable with Frankenstein, why it crossed the Atlantic so easily, is it does both. It bridges the gap between both types of Gothic. Here we have the concept of, it's also a gritty reboot of the Gothic as well, by making it a Gothic of the nursery. When one thinks of Frankenstein and his reaction and sort of revulsion and horror, it is in some ways a male postpartum revulsion. And the trauma of afterbirth is actually a direct quote from one feminist author, which sort of takes this very familiar story of sort of the unspoken ambivalence of the difficulty of birth. Shelley's mother died shortly after childbirth. Her daughter sort of died after was premature and died, and that dream of reviving her infant daughter is the dream that motivated the story of Frankenstein for her. And so you have that. We also have Gilbert and Gubar. Who note that she read 100 books a year which is an extraordinary pace of reading. None of us do that. And during the 4 years where she was writing and sort of thinking up this story before and afterwards, she was almost entirely either pregnant, confined for pregnancy, or nursing, or in mourning for children who did not survive. And so this sort of birth and her literary education are sort of intimately bound up. And this book was a coming out party. This is what they mean by bibliogenesis. It's a birth through books. And so she comes out, it's sort of a debutante's ball, except for the literary world, given her upbringing. And notably, Dr. Frankenstein is motivated by fear of rejection by his father, and she was definitively rejected by her father for her choice in men. So it's notable this shows up here as both the monster as an artwork come alive, a horrifying Pygmalion for a novel that itself took on a life of its own, an icon that shambled into our culture, but also the experience of this is not going to be a seamless window onto the world of England and radical science. You're going to be looking at this through the prism of letters, through stories told at second and third hand, through diary entries and reports, and you're going to it highlights the act of reading, just as the characters themselves are reading these very unreliable narrators. Frankenstein and his creature. It's okay if you're a little skeptical of some of the stories that they're telling because they're clearly motivated to justify their actions. And so a little skeptical reading is a good thing. We grapple with them as they grapple with each other. And this is a well-crafted book. And this is my last slide. But ultimately, the monster's own defense lies in the center of the novel. But we have Walton's tale unfolds Frankenstein's, which unfolds his monsters. There's tale within a tale within a tale. And the hero and the antagonist are one and the same, doubles of each other. Dr. Frankenstein pursues his own monstrosity, who leads clues to lead him on the path in case he gets lost. Elizabeth and Justine, two central female characters, are doubles, virtually. They have the same biography. They're foundlings, feel guilty at the brother's death, rescued from poverty. Walton is incredibly similar to Frankenstein. It's almost as if Frankenstein is talking to himself at the end of the novel, as they are both ambitious, isolated, and have been or are going on a voyage of scientific discovery. And he tells this story to Walton so that he might avoid his fate. And so lastly, and I'll sort of leave this especially resonant little image for you from my mother to pick up, which is Frankenstein's mother gives Elizabeth to Dr. Victor Frankenstein as a gift to him when he's a child. And he then, when faced with that same request by his child, by the creature, he refuses to do what his mother had done with his beloved Elizabeth. And that's just such a fraught emotional knot that I can't possibly explain it, and I'll turn things over to a professional.
Well, I said David would go first because he's much more entertaining than I am. And I'm going to start with a little shout out. How many people in this audience are teachers or have been teachers? This is for you. The number of hours I spent preparing 20 minutes. I could have worked at McDonald's and made more money than I did. So thanks for all the teachers who taught, all the students who ended up coming back to give this kind of talk. Thank you. I'm also going to ask another question. I'm going to seed my talk with questions because when I stop, which is hopefully right around 3, I want you to ask questions. And I'll probably tell a few more stories than my notes will allow me to, which means I might go beyond 3 o'clock. How many people have read Frankenstein? Wow. How many people have read it recently rather than in the past? Okay. How many people would like to know why to read Frankenstein who haven't read it? There's at least one person I know would like to know. There we go. All right, well, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm a member of Falmouth Reads Together. The first time I read Frankenstein, I had never read it before. I read it so that I could engage in the discussion of whether we should select it. I read it like most people read something that has to be read by a certain time. I read it quickly. The second time I read it was when I said, yes, we would do this panel, Understanding the Other, the human and the monster in the human. And I read it and I underlined all of the psychologically significant passages, and I was incredibly impressed with Mary Shelley's understanding of human nature. This is, Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, or published it in 1900. Well before Freud and the advent of modern psychology, Mary Shelley nails the issue of guilt and shame. And I'm going to sort of go over that. That's the heart of the talk. I also brought, and I'm going to leave it with Adrian for the reference, there's a wonderful article called Shame. It was written in the Atlantic Monthly in 1992, which covers all of the psychoanalytic literature which was important, so that you don't have to reread the essential papers on narcissism. Since we've had so much snow and cold, I've actually had a real chance to reread most of the famous papers on narcissism. So the first thing I'm going to say is beware of the either-or error. This is sort of a tip for your life. If you start to categorize people as either good or evil, acceptable or detestable, sane or crazy, the elect or the damned, you're going to start to look at that you have a problem with shame. We all have a problem with shame. I'm not saying that it's just for some people. My talk comes out of the experience of listening to people for now 30 years, a little over 30 years, and helping them reveal their secrets. And how you do that is this phenomenon which seems so easy but is really hard. It's called empathy. Empathy is not agreement. Empathy is not there, no, tisk. That's sympathy. Empathy is a method by which you try to get into the story, like Frankenstein tells Walton, the things that you are too ashamed to admit to. And you need really a safe environment free of judgment to do that. And it takes a while, and I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. But this, if you can't do this lack of self-acceptance will lead to projecting unwanted or disgusting aspects of yourself onto another person. It will lead to denial, distortion, blame, and shame. So I want you to start to think about how common this is. There's a wonderful, I'm very supportive of the recovery community, in particular AA and all of its programs. They have a wonderful saying which saves you a lot of time if you want to just use one. You're only as sick as your secrets. I would say that Dr. Frankenstein is a case study in the sickening power of secrets. And I think that Mary Shelley's classic is a classic that stands the test of time because her main characters, both Victor and the monster, are nuanced and complicated. Maybe because she hung out with so many poets, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, Coleridge, and having some significant psychological problems herself. As David referenced, she lost her mother when she was an infant. She had an intense romantic attachment to her father. She loses a lot of children. She ends up losing Percy Shelley. She runs away. She elopes. I would say that she had a quite sophisticated understanding of melancholia. And in the character of Viktor Frankl, probably bipolar, the frenzy, and then the crash into despair. He has at least 3 nervous breakdowns in the novel. She also understood narcissism. I think, again, her father, her then, at some point, husband. Addiction. Laudanum is an opiate derivative in the novel. In the end, after his best friend Henry's murder, Viktor Frankl starts to take laudanum for calm forgetfulness. And the other issue, of course, is grief. In the oldest understanding of manic depressive disorder, it would be said that mania is a flight from grief. That if you really look at the first breakdowns, you will see some sort of loss. And again, I have a million stories about this, but I'll try to stop myself. So what I'm going to talk about is guilt and shame and how it applies to the characters. What I'm not going to do, because they were real people, is I'm not going to psychoanalyze Mary Shelley or any of her circle. I think that's sort of creepy to do that, to tell you the truth. But I will, with great abandon, tackle Viktor Frankenstein and the monster. Guilt. Probably that was the hallmark emotion for the psychoanalytic community. Freud's paramount discovery as part of the Oedipal complex, the incestuous urges of the child and their frustration. It prevented most psychoanalytic psychologists from exploring the prevalence of shame as pathogenic, meaning creating illness. Guilt by its nature seeks absolution or forgiveness. Guilt is caused by a transgression, a crossing of boundaries, especially a taboo. Guilt is about something I do. Shame, which is hidden, on the other hand, is about who I am. Shame by its nature hides, fears disclosure of a terrible truth about oneself that would result in rejection and abandonment by, well, usually a parent, idealized or deeded other, either mother or father or both. So shame assumes the negative judgment of a critical or contemptuous other, leading to the feeling that one is unworthy of being loved. So when I'm describing this, if you have read the book, think about how many people Viktor Frankl does not confide in once the murder of his brother starts. He doesn't tell his father, who he esteems. He does not go to either one of his mentors. He does not tell Elizabeth, although he promises, and this is the most manipulative part of his character, that he'll tell her the day after their marriage. Well, if he's really going to be a nice guy, why wouldn't you tell her the day before the marriage? So he is so ashamed of what he's done that he can't tell anybody. And you see that that's what leads to madness. Adrian said comment to us that this is a tragedy. And I think it is. I mean, it's interesting to hear about Gothic novels, but I think that, like Shakespeare, Mary Shelley understood the nature of hubris and the nature of a self-destructive trait that just doesn't stop. So I know Camilla would have talked a little bit about parenting, and I'll make a couple of points. The way that this presents is that children feel very intuitively whether they are being securely loved for who they really are, which I would say is warts and all, or whether in some cases the mother is needing the child to be an emblem of her goodness, to succeed. The father, it's usually in the world of work and ambition, and with the mother, it's that they continue to be loving and have a family. So the child will sense whether they are held in a realistically secure way or whether the love is conditional on performance. And you can figure it out whether it's you have to be bright enough, make enough money, be attractive enough. If the child feels that they are going to be disapproved of, they will conform to what the expectation of the parent is. So there's a classic book by Alice Miller. In hardback, it's called Drama of the Gifted Child, and in paperback, it's called Prisoners of Childhood. And she has a line in it which moved me incredibly. She says, "What if I had been bad, or smelly, or ugly? Where would your love have been then?" Now, obviously, I think the monster is the victim of that kind of, but we all are to some degree. So why did I want this? I reluctantly wanted it, but I eventually signed on. I really want this community to engage in thinking about this book. I want you to, I'm not going to ask you what these things are for you, but I want you to think about or examine how often we all judge, dismiss, demean, or demonize those whose differences threaten our self-esteem. In the article Shame, there's a quote from Nathanson in the article that said he believes that Nazism was a shame-based movement. So I'm saying not only does it go from you to our community, it will go to our world. And these are things that if I had more time I would really talk more about. How would understanding the phenomena of shame help us to mediate the effects of hatred? The persistence of racism, particularly based on our own history of slavery, and our propensity towards war and injustice. And I would just reference certainly the Innocence Project, which is looking at mainly African American prisoners on death row and the DNA testing, how many innocent people are on death row. This is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which I think was a healing movement for South Africa. The Public Conversations Project, which is out of Watertown, which started after the murders at the abortion clinic in Brooklyn, where a group of religious women clergy got together and looked at calling abortion murder. And what that did, that resulted in somebody crossing that boundary and shooting people in an abortion clinic. The issue of capital punishment, the third time through reading this novel was the same week that the federal government decided to pursue the death penalty for the marathon bomber, even though the cost of doing it is extraordinarily high. And I think it is a sign of our own primitiveness that we still do this. That's what I think. And in general, a divisiveness about our political discourse, which I'm horrified about, how quickly we can dismiss, demean, and label the other person, no matter what your background is. These are what we call shame rage cycles. When you shame somebody, you're going to enrage them. And when you look at, let's say, why did World War I result in World War II? It's because we shamed and humiliated in defeat Germany, which produced Nazism. Now, these are things that, of course, in 10 minutes I'm not going to be able to tell you about, but I'm going to tell you a little, well, not a little story. I'm going to tell you a story from my clinical practice. I started in Cambridge. I'm not going to tell any stories from Falmouth. But probably 30 years ago, I had a practice on Brattle Street. I saw a young man who was an MIT graduate, recent MIT graduate. He was Japanese American. He came in to talk to me. He had had an experience in a restaurant where he got nauseous and was going to throw up, went to the men's room, and was so humiliated he could not go eat in restaurants, which was a detriment to his career. So he came in, and these days, as I know would happen, I would take a symptom checklist. I'd come up with a diagnosis of either a panic disorder, a social anxiety disorder. I'd give him some Paxil, and I'd send him out. I wouldn't do that, but that's what is now being done. The idea of taking the history and finding out what's really going on, that's almost not being done, which, as you can tell, bothers me. So this young man, we talked for a while, probably maybe 6 months into it. He told me a lot about, very boundaried issues in the Japanese culture. If I said, I really like your necklace, I would be required to offer you the necklace. Very scripted, very modest, very boundaried. So the idea that this guy was totally overwhelmed that he was going to throw up was horrifying to him. At one point, and I can still see it, he just looked away for a minute, and I said something brilliant like, "What are you thinking?" And he said, I wouldn't say, "What are you feeling?" Not with this particular person. You wouldn't do that. He said, "I was just thinking about the look on my father's face when they rounded us up and took us to an internment camp in California. Once you got the backstory of what this was about, you understood why he was literally at the age of 24 disabled with shame. Once you dealt with that, he was much more able to go back into the world." These are the kinds of things that make shame incredibly important. Okay. I've said enough of that. There are littler examples of that. There's a wonderful New Yorker cartoon. I love the New Yorker cartoons. I can't say I love the New Yorker poetry, where there's a couple coming out of a party, and the wife turns to her husband and says, "What's the plural of faux pas?" We've all had the experience of feeling like we have had an offending joke. We've been too eager to please. We've stepped out of bounds in these minor ways. Those feelings that you have when you do that are shame. Why did the psychoanalytic community take so much time to find it? Probably in the 70s, Helen Block Lewis started to research it. Since, that's like 70 years after Freud. Why did this happen? Shame was considered as a social context problem. It would lead more to social work, which is my training. So it would be about, poverty, class, gender. It wasn't considered internal. It was considered interpersonal. It was also considered feminine. So that is really tells you why we even covered up the issue of shame. And if you reread the early Freud cases or the early Kohut cases, what you'll see is so much was covered up. With Freud, he backed away from the seduction theory, which is women disclosing father-daughter incest. He originally got it, and then he said, oh no, it's the child's urge. It is not the parental violation. That, until Oprah came out about incest, that was not talked about. Okay, in 7 minutes, I'm going to talk about Frankenstein. I have to tell you, I didn't initially love this book, and I now love this book. I've read it now 3 times. And what I love about it is, what David was talking about doubling, is that the character of Dr. Frankenstein and the monster are mirror images of each other. They start off there, and they actually become one, consumed by vengeance and hatred. Now, I'm going to do this very quickly, just so that it's a spoiler alert. If you haven't read the book, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I found in the book, so you can say, oh, I wish she hadn't told me that, because now I don't have to read the book. Read the book. From Victor's self-report, which, as David said, may not be totally accurate. You're preaching to the converted. People often say, how come you didn't know that? I keep saying, I'm not a private detective. I don't go out and find out what. But this is his subjective experience. From Victor's self-report, his father married very late in life. In fact, it says in his decline of life, he married a much younger woman he rescued from poverty. Gratitude and worship marked his attachment to his wife. He retired from public life soon after his marriage to devote himself to her and his family. And this is a direct quote from the book. There was a sense of justice in my father's upright mind, which rendered it necessary that he should approve highly to love strongly. And one would assume that if he disapproved, it would lead to rejection. I think if you really look at the father-son relationship in this one, you're going to get a clue about why Victor had such unbridled ambition. Then Victor speculates that his father had had an earlier betrayal in a love relationship, leading him to overly value tried worth. Now, that means that it's going to be awfully hard for Victor to tell his father that he's made a huge mistake. Victor describes his mother as sheltered and indulged. Everything was made to yield to her wishes and convenience. An only child for 5 years, which would be at the height of the Oedipal crisis, he's doted on by both his parents. Much as they were attached to each other, they seemed to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from the very mine of love to bestow on me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol. Oh, no. says I, because that is, of course, the setup for the narcissistic personality. The child is overvalued. You have the neglect on one side. And if the parents do not help the child realize that they are not the most precious being in the world, it sets the child up to be shamed, because they don't realize that that love, which is wonderful, is sort of an overweening self-importance. It gets you some places, it doesn't get you others. All right, I'm going to move through a little bit. Mother wants a daughter, they adopt Elizabeth, as David was saying. This is what they say about her. I have a pretty present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it. She presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift. I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally and looked upon Elizabeth as mine. She was to be mine only. Now, if you can't see a foreshadowing of what's going to happen later on, I don't know. So then he says later, Victor, no human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My temper was sometimes violent and my passions vehement. Well, those two things seem to be at odds, but nonetheless. But I think that when you ask people about their childhood, when you hear that they had a perfect childhood and that everything was fine, clearly something is being blocked. Early on in the book, Victor finds and reads Cornelius Agrippa, and the father, he's 13 years old at this point, says, "My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." And you can see that Victor has this shame reaction. He immediately says, if instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me, then, this would not happen. Throughout the book, every time Victor Frankenstein gets close to acknowledging his responsibility, he finds something or someone to blame, usually the monster. Okay. I'm going to jump forward. You mentioned he makes the monster 8 feet tall. There are two things that happen before he decides to do that. One is he tells you there are two mentors. Monsieur Krempe, I probably mispronounced it, was the mentor who also told him that he had spent his time studying nonsense. He describes him, this is again how important his appearance is, as a squat little man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. As opposed to Mr. Waldman, he had the sweetest voice I ever heard. The either-or error. You're either all good or you're all bad. He decides to make him 8 foot tall. Makes you wonder how tall Percy Shelley was, Victor Frankenstein was, because, and proportionately large. And I have two stories about, as you notice, I am not tall. I've had two experiences of seeing, I've told David both of these stories. One, I saw Bill Walton, the former Celtics, in the Coop in Harvard Square. Bill Walton is now doing commercials for Good Feet. So I was reminded that I had seen him. He is quite tall. He's also not terribly attractive. What did I notice? I noticed how tall he was. At the same time, I was at Simmons School of Social Work. I saw Robert Parrish walking down Newbury Street. Now, Robert Parrish is 7 foot tall. All I noticed about Robert Parrish is how handsome he was. So that tells you that your perception of what you think is actually real is much more based on appearance than it is on fact. Okay, I'm going to fast forward a little bit more about my favorite part of the book, when the monster tells his story. The human dimension of the monster raises the question, would you believe him? This is what he says. I ought to be thy Adam. I was benevolent and good. Misery has made me a fiend. And most of Volume 2 in the book is about the hardships and about the family that he's looking from the hovel into this family, which is where he learns language, music, to read Paradise Lost, and Plutarch's Lives. He said, I long to join them. This trait of kindness moved me sensibly. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? What was I? The question to be answered only with groans. So would you have believed the monster? Now this is after, of course, the murder of William, and what he says about the murder of William is he thought a child would be unprejudiced. And when he picks up the child screams at him. And that's why he murders William. He murders Henry after he's told that Frankenstein's not going to make him a bride. And this is in a direct reference. The monster speaks again. God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours. So this is the taboo that Victor crosses, where the guilt comes from, that he had dared to be God. He says, the monster says again, Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. No Eve to soothe my sorrow. I was alone. My Creator had abandoned me. So this moves Victor to agree. And then what David mentioned, what moves him to change his mind is the fear of creating another species that is going to annihilate. So I'm going to just fast forward to the end. In terms of another part of the book that I thought was incredibly amazing, is that the monster warns Frankenstein, I will be with you on your wedding night. He said, and then Frankenstein remembers it right before he gets married. So what does he do? He leaves Elizabeth alone. What kind of man is that? And he just paces, because Victor is so narcissistic, he thinks the monster's coming after him. Even though he's already killed William, he's going to kill Henry. I mean, you would think by this point he'd figure out that he's going to destroy everybody that Frankenstein loves. So this is, again, the secret continues. It is only in telling the story to Walton is there any form of healing for Victor Frankenstein. And it's actually only in telling the story, the monster story, to Frankenstein is there any evolution, and then it regresses right away when he doesn't make him a mate. This is the end of the book. And the final scene is between Walton, who is advised by Frankenstein to seek happiness and tranquility and to avoid ambition before his death, and the monster. The monster says, I abhorred myself. That was about the murder of Henry. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse to kill Elizabeth. Evil henceforth became my good. I'm going to say be careful of the way that we hate, because it will turn us into monsters. At the end, Walton says, I love this. I might actually use it in my office. Wretch, it is well that you came here to whine over the desolation that you have made. You lament only because the victim of your malignity is withdrawn from your power. In other words, once Frankenstein dies, the monster has no purpose, because vengeance is the thing that draws the monster and Frankenstein into a symbiotic bond. So really the final question I have is, do you think the monster will kill himself? I'm going to end, I said this, I was going to end with a little benediction. It's from the poem, I have to do something in poetry, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Coleridge, which of course was a huge influence on Mary Shelley. Farewell, farewell, but this I tell, to thee, thou wedding guest. He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. Thank you.